So you'll be getting a bit too much of me this morning, but don't worry, I'll be quiet all afternoon. So I'm going to talk to you about design anthropology for wellbeing. I'm originally an anthropologist, although all of my work is completely interdisciplinary now. But design anthropology, I think, has a lot to contribute in terms of the way we think about wellbeing and also the way that we can design for wellbeing. I'm going to start off by thinking about wellbeing as the challenge that I think that we confront and what I also think our network should be working towards. So wellbeing, that it's much desired, it's generally considered to be positive, but it's a tricky concept. Now, why is it a tricky concept? Because we don't really know exactly what it is. It's not just one thing. We've already been starting to have a discussion about what's care and what's wellbeing. How do we really define these things? So I think the meaning of wellbeing is actually quite elusive. It could be an individual feeling. It's always subjective. It's always culturally conditioned as well. It's determined. What we think is our well-being is determined by a whole lot of things that come from our personal biographies, but our culture and everything that's around us. It cannot be measured. Now, some people think you can measure well-being. There are measures of happiness. Lots of people try to do quantitative studies of how happy everybody is everywhere in the world, and they say that one country is happier than another. Then other people start saying, well, how can you imagine that everyone in that country is happier than everywhere else because of this and that? So the way people answer questions in questionnaires, the way statistics and data is produced is highly questionable in terms of what you're really measuring and what you can really know. But the thing is about well-being as well, perhaps it's not something that can be expressed in words or numbers or any way that is actually that explicit or easy to communicate. Maybe actually well-being is something that's experienced, maybe it's experiential, maybe it's a feeling, maybe it's a memory, a sense of something we felt in the past. Maybe it's an imagined sense of being comfortable. Maybe it's a hope for the future. But maybe it's actually something we feel in our bodies and we sense. We might not even say when we're experiencing it, but we might say when we're not. Maybe it's something performed. But for me, actually, well-being is, and I think we've already had some mention of that fact, that well-being should be everywhere, shouldn't just be in a hospital. Maybe we can find it in other places. We should seek to create it in other places. And it's actually one of the core elements of life that my research always seeks to uncover. In many of my past projects, it's been this question of actually, how do we feel all right? What do we need to have around us? Who do we need to have around us? What material circumstances? What material conditions? What kind of weather? What kind of temperature? What things, what processes need to be in place for us to feel comfortable in our lives, for us to be able to feel all right? And actually, well-being isn't about feeling really, really elated, really amazing, really fantastic. It's about feeling that everything around you is good enough for you to be able to proceed and to carry on. It's about us all being okay. We often can't hope for a lot more. But once we feel all right, once we feel comfortable, when we're in a familiar environment then, we can feel many other things. We can trust other things and people around us. We actually know that we can do the things we want to do because we're in a good enough situation to be able to do them. We feel safe. And that's not just safe from absolute danger. It's about being in a safe place where we can do what we wish. We can feel that everything all right is around us if it's all right enough to be able to be comfortable. We can collaborate with other people because we know that we can trust them, we know we feel safe with them. So a whole load of things actually start to come about when we feel all right. So this well-being is not just important for our health, of course, it's actually enabling in many other ways. So, we're looking for well-being. As I said, there's a challenge. It's a fundamental goal, but it's also elusive. We can't actually design well-being itself. What we can do, though, is to try to design the conditions that will enable people to create it. And to do that, we need interdisciplinary approaches. We need new approaches. We actually need to learn how to make well-being a possibility, not to think we can actually make it and apply it and put it in a place somewhere. So why design anthropology for well-being? As I said before, and I'm an anthropologist, so that's one of the reasons why I would advocate for it. But design anthropology has lots of advantages in this space. It's interdisciplinary, it's collaborative, and it's also interventional. It's very different from what any of us might understand traditional anthropology to be. The advantage there is also that design anthropology is about bringing disciplines together so we can do work with each other. We can actually start to leak in and out of each other's disciplines. We can actually start to do things that go beyond disciplinary practice, which can be very limiting. It also brings together academic scholarship and applied practice. One of the big advantages of doing design anthropology is actually because we're theoretical. We actually create dialogues between anthropological theory and the practice that we're engaged in. That also answers up to a point, one of the points that Lorraine made about the idea of work not just being human-centred. Anthropology is about people, but anthropology is also about materials. It's about sensory experiences. It's about the unspoken aspects of our worlds. Anthropology has theories of how we engage with material aspects of our lives, the objects in it, the processes in it, the things that aren't human. It can actually enable a lot of understanding in that field. But it also attends ethnographically to the sensory and the unspoken ways that people feel in the world. I won't go into a long definition of ethnography, but doing ethnography means getting under the surface of what's already happening. Actually means hanging out with people, doing things with people, really actually getting into the world that people live in and seeing how people are actually engaging with things and materials and those non-human things in their worlds. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. It also focuses, though, very much on some of the core concepts we use in our work, the contingencies of everyday life. So there's contingent circumstances in everyday life that make things happen that we can't necessarily predict. We don't really know exactly what's going to happen next. We all have a pretty good idea of what might happen next, but little things, small things, or bigger things come up that mean that we actually have to improvise to fill in the gaps between what we thought might be going to happen and what exactly does happen, what we think things maybe should be like and what they're not quite like. So people actually fill in the gaps, people carry on, they make life work for them. And actually I think that's what people do to generate well-being as well. And they do that through their human creativity. So what we want to do in design anthropology, and also particularly in the project I'm going to talk about, the Bendigo project, we actually try to learn from how people already create well-being and think of that as a form of good practice that we can then think about how do we actually help to design the conditions that people need to actually create more well-being. We also, as anthropologists, use lots of text, and I recognise that my presentation is not quite as exciting as Lorraine's was in terms of all of the images. So what do we do? How do we find well-being? So if we need to actually identify what it is, to search for it in our research, how do we find it? What we've been doing is using these concepts of contingency and improvisation to actually understand how well-being emerges in life. And in my research projects over the last 20 years or so, I've been doing that in many contexts, which has also answered one of the questions that has arisen already. In terms of how people make homes, how do people make a sense of home? How do you actually feel all right in your home? That's the very first question I always ask when I do research about people's lives in their homes. And that can apply also to work that I've done about how care is delivered in homes. In healthcare contexts as well. Lots of care will be delivered in homes in future, so it's a really important thing to think about as we have an increasing ageing population. And also an increasing digital service economy by which people can access more care in their homes. How do we make safety? A lot of my work is around occupational safety and health. Again, actually how do people improvise to make safe working environments and how to make safety work for them? Again, the creative health context, another project I've been engaged with RMIT in Ecuador, who will be speaking later, is actually thinking about how do people improvise in a whole range of different healthcare contexts, which might be outside hospitals. But what I want to focus on as an example is our Design for Wellbeing project, in which we've been collaborating with Bendigo Hospital and Exemplar Health. Now, this is a 3-year research project, as we've already had explained by Lorraine. It has 2 phases. Firstly, the before the move context, and the after the move context. Now, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the before the move context, but what's been very inspiring and exciting about this project is actually, as well as the 2 phases of research we've been engaged to do, we've also been able to develop design projects in between. And we've been involved in student design studios that our researchers flowed into, and also a phase we're going to be moving into next, where some prototypes are going to be actually sent to the hospital. And we're going to be doing some more research around those prototypes. So what started off as an already reasonably sized project has actually emerged into something really, really exciting and inspiring, in addition to the already interesting work we were doing. We're going to be testing the prototypes ethnographically to actually see how people engage with them. Now, to be able to do a project like this involves interdisciplinary teamwork. And we started with myself. and Lorraine as the co-investigators of the project. And I would say in this project I'm a design anthropologist, and Lorraine is involved as a designer. And we then Shanti Sumatoyu, who we've met, started to work with us, and Shanti's work is rooted in geography. And this year now, Melissa Duque, who is an everyday designer, is working with us on the project as well. Margot Annemans, who will be speaking very soon, an architect, and Juan Senin, who's an industrial designer, have also joined us in our project this year and next year. So we've actually built a really fantastic and growing interdisciplinary research team. We also have the industrial and communication design studio leaders and the students who participated in those studios on board, as well, of course, as our collaborators at Bendigo Hospital, who are also our co-authors on the papers we're writing. So we've really brought together people from so many disciplines now and engaged them in this project that we're able to do so much more than we would be able to do if we were just working from one perspective. Now I'm going to focus in on the anthropological ethnography we've been doing in this project, because that's the particular part that I'm most engaged in and in designing. And as I said before, we do ethnography because it gets under the surface of what's said and what is observable. We don't just want to observe what people are doing and make notes about it. We don't just want to hear what people say. We actually want to try to get under the surface to understand how people feel. So we follow everyday life as it happens. We follow the people, but not just the people, because as Lorraine said, design that's just about, it's just human-centred is not enough. We follow the things, we follow the materials, and we follow the processes. Now that means we've been following some quite interesting things like trolleys and doors, which will come up again. We collaborate with the participants to understand their sensory and their emotional experiences and their existing modes of creating well-being, because we really want to know how people already create well-being, but how do they create them with things and objects and materials and processes, not just how do they do it on their own. We also, as I said before, do our research in dialogue with theory, and we create new theory and we make contributions to academic debates. And we tend to do that in the middle of the project before we come up with our applied findings, because that adds to what we can learn as researchers who want to actually do practical things in the world. Now, what does it tell us? So we've been able to really learn about how well-being comes about through staff and patients' everyday design of things like atmospheres, movement, sounds, touch, and visual displays. And I'll show you a few examples of those. We've been looking at things like this message tree that was produced by staff and patients in the old hospital. Something that was improvised out of human creativity, but that came to mean an awful lot to patients and to staff. Things like this very simple picture on the wall, which we were told actually was in a sensory room, that patients found relaxing and calming. These eggs, which I think was one of Shanti's favourite things, which again were part of the sensory aspect of the sensory practices that staff engaged in with patients in terms of helping people to feel calm and to relax. But we found particularly that in a hospital, and anybody who's been in a hospital might not have thought of that, but will think about it if you now, I hope, is there are a lot of trolleys in hospitals. Lots of things get delivered on trolleys. Not only medicines, but the cleaning is done by means of a trolley. The food is delivered by means of a trolley as well. And also we found that staff had actually developed sensory trolleys as a way to deliver some of the sensory care services that they were providing to patients who couldn't get to the sensory rooms or in wards where there weren't any sensory rooms. Now, we found then that movement was very important in terms of delivering care, because lots of the staff who deliver care, and not necessarily formal care, did so as they moved through the wards. These are always contingent circumstances. People had to plan what was on their trolleys as a mode of actually anticipating what they might need. They had to deliver to improvise some of those aspects of care. And there's also invisible care embedded in some of the services and relationships, like the way that food was delivered and how it was plated for people. What design anthropology can do is actually identify some of these otherwise undocumented and invisible sources of well-being and bring them to the surface, actually mean that we know about them. These improvisations matter a lot. And think about how we can actually use that knowledge to build on those, to create new circumstances for well-being. Because it's these forms of invisible care that actually create the circumstances for well-being. So those are some of our findings. But what we then did with these findings is we took them into back into the university. The sensory trolleys were very important. As I said, they enable staff to use those sensory materials with patients. We learnt how important the trolleys were in other ways for delivering care. So we actually took that work into the studios. A lot of this was Shanti's work, to ask design students to respond to those examples of good practice, to think about what could actually be done with the notion of the sensory trolley. How could that actually be used to enable people to create new forms of well-being? Now, these are some of the designs our students came up with. It's absolutely fantastic trolleys, and these are going to be taken into the hospital now. Some of them have been selected. This is obviously a trolley with herbs and plants and watering can. It's another trolley which is designed with lots of these were handmade letters which were printed and made for the trolley. Absolutely incredible work which the students produced. So the whole idea there is now to take these trolleys into the hospital to be evaluated in situ so people can actually try them out. The students' work can be put into real-world situations. Now, we don't expect the trolleys themselves to change people's levels of well-being, but what we think will happen then is that the trolleys will actually be the things that people can use to generate a sense of well-being. So this is very much about the relationship between people and materials. People and the physical sensory sensations they can derive from the practice and activities they engage with the trolleys, the processes and the activities that will develop in relation to them. Now, the trolleys aren't solutions to a problem. They're meant to open up possibilities for people to gain new senses of well-being. We're not thinking about designing to solve problems. We're about thinking about how to design to open up possibilities for well-being so that people can actually create more well-being with new things. So this is my summing up, future well-being. I think the real challenge then isn't to design modes of well-being and apply them to people. The challenge is to think differently about that to well-being, to start projects with an ethnographic question of how people already generate well-being themselves, how to design with this research process. And that's the point, I think somebody asked a question at the end of Lorraine's talk. How do these projects get put together? For me, the essential thing is actually start thinking about how do we do research before a design project starts at all? How do we actually start to understand the existing good practice and the way things happen already and design in relation to that? How do we actually acknowledge the everyday designing that leads to well-being and how to nurture that? And that's one of Melissa's core aspects of her practice, the everyday designing. So again, we're very much within our everyday interdisciplinary research team. And to understand the ways that people move through and in their environments as a process through which they can generate feelings of well-being. The challenge is to start thinking about well-being from those perspectives from the beginning. So what we want to do is to create interdisciplinary projects so which we can actually design buildings and services in dialogue with ethnographic studies for how people already improvise to fill the gaps themselves. That doesn't mean the role of the designer as designer isn't important as well, but it's something we want to bring together with the role of the designer and the architect and healthcare professionals much, much more closely. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I've probably gone over time.